it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chester Chidello.
This week, Russiagate 2.0. US Intel says the usual suspects were up to their old tricks again last year.
Joe Biden's immigration headache is getting worse. I'm going to look at why it's happening.
And I'm going to look at the Violence Against Women Act, which is up for renewal this week.
And the filibuster might be about to get busted. But first... It's very funny.
The 2020 US election was the target of a Russian influence campaign to denigrate now President Biden and his candidacy and benefit now former President Trump's prospects for re-election. That is one of the key findings of a newly declassified US intelligence community assessment of foreign threats to last year's election. Konstantin Kilimnik, described here as a Russian influence agent, and a network of others, including Russian-backed Ukrainian politician Andrei Derkash, sought to, quote, use prominent US persons and media conduits to launder their narratives to US officials and audiences. They also helped produce a documentary that aired on a US television network in late January 2020. The declassified version of this report does not say what that program was, and it is policy for US intelligence not to name US citizens, although a number of intelligence experts note there is a program that fits the timeline. One American news network's The Ukraine Hoax, Impeachment, Biden Cash and Mass Murder, with guest host Michael Caputo, which aired on January 25, 2020. It promoted a counterfactual narrative that Ukraine, not Russia, interfered in the 2016 US elections and that Joe Biden and his son Hunter were cashing in.
On the next One America News Investigates, Michael Caputo exposes the cover-up that led to the impeachment of President Trump and mass murder. The Democrats' crusade to kick our duly elected president out of office didn't start with a phone call. It began with Ukrainian corruption, election meddling, and a bloody coup that cleared a path for Hunter Biden to get rich.
That was the same false narrative that was promoted by President Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, after his numerous meetings with Andrei Derkash, who has been identified by US officials as an active Russian agent for over a decade, Chaz.
We should actually emphasise Giuliani was seriously into Derkash. He was one of Giuliani's prime sources for years. Giuliani described him at the time as very helpful and said they talked many times about Ukraine. But don't worry, because Rudy also said that Derkash doesn't seem pro-Russian to me.
Oh, devilishly clever.
Even after the US Treasury revealed Derkash was a Russian agent late last year, Rudy said the chance that Derkash is a Russian spy is no better than 50-50, and that Rudy's guess was that George Soros was behind the accusation because Soros wants to create a socialist country. Great call, Rudy.
Well, that Ukrainian theory that Derkash shared with Giuliani was, of course, the same conspiracy theory that President Trump tried to substantiate by threatening to withhold military aid from Ukraine in 2019, leading, of course, to his first impeachment. And look at the host and alleged producer of that program, Michael Caputo. Who's he again? Michael Caputo is a longtime Republican political operative and associate of Donald Trump's friend and former campaign manager, friend of the show, Roger Stone. Caputo moved to Russia in the early 1990s, married a Russian, and was a top advisor to President Boris Yeltsin. He then did PR for Vladimir Putin. Caputo divorced the Russian, worked in Ukraine in the early 2000s, married a Ukrainian, and was a senior advisor to Donald Trump in 2016. Last year, President Trump made Caputo spokesman for the US Department of Health and Human Services. That was until last September when Caputo posted this jaw-dropping video on Facebook.
Partisan Democrats, the conjugal media, and the scientists, the deep state scientists, want America sick through November. They cannot afford for us to have any good news before November because they're already losing. There are scientists working for this government who do not want America to get better. Did you hear me? There are scientists who work for this government who do not want America to get well, not until after Joe Biden is president. It's a fact. I know it because I've heard it.
Caputo also warned Democrats would not accept Trump had won re-election. And when Donald Trump refuses to stand down at the inauguration, the shooting will begin. And he told Trump supporters, if they carry guns, to buy ammunition. Remember, this is one of the top officials at Donald Trump's health department at the time, when they're also at the height of a pandemic and an election campaign, accusing scientists at the Centers for Disease Control of wanting to damage Trump by prolonging the pandemic. Well, Caputo then took medical leave, citing poor mental health, and then he revealed that he had been diagnosed with throat, neck and head cancer. Meanwhile, Konstantin Kilimnik's name probably rings a bell too. He's a longtime associate of Trump's 2016 campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, who was jailed for 7 years for bank fraud and witness tampering before being pardoned by President Trump earlier this year. Kilimnik is also a Russian intelligence officer, according to the 2020 Senate Intelligence Committee report into the election. One of the contacts between members of the 2016 Trump campaign and Russian officials or agents that generated the most interest from investigators, including the likes of Special Counsel Robert Mueller, were the meetings between Kilimnik and Paul Manafort.
While Paul Manafort was serving as Donald Trump's campaign chairman, he was in contact at least twice with a man named Konstantin Kilimnik, a former employee of Manafort's consulting company, also described by Robert Mueller as a man with ties to Russian intelligence.
The pair discussed a possible peace plan for Ukraine that analysts say was decidedly pro-Russian, and Manafort then shared Trump's internal polling data with Kilimnik, who was later indicted by Mueller. Interesting as well that Kilimnik and Michael Caputo moved in the same circles in the old days in Moscow as well. Caputo telling the New York Times that back in the 1990s, there was talk of Kilimnik being related to Russian intelligence agencies. What we do know is this: the One American News Network was running false information and pro-Trump propaganda, possibly including a program paid for by the Kremlin. We also know from this report the Kremlin was feeding the same misinformation to other media figures and Trump associates, again unnamed. We also know it did not get Trump re-elected, but did it dampen support for Joe Biden? There is some reassuring news, though, in this to report as well. In 2020, there was no indication that any foreign actor attempted to alter any technical aspect of the voting process, including voter registration, casting ballots, vote tabulation, or reporting results. So, lots more shady stuff going on last year from a cast of the usual suspects, Chaz, but this new report is not just about Russia. At the same time, Iran was working on the other side of the street trying to damage Donald Trump. Joe Biden even had Cuba on his side, even though that didn't really help him out with the Cuban-American vote in Florida, I'll note.
Yeah, let's leave Cuba for a second. The assessment does say, though, about Iran that it carried out a multi-pronged covert influence campaign intended to undercut Trump's prospects, albeit without promoting Biden. Also, they aim to undermine public confidence in the electoral process and sow division. If you remember last year, some of that was very public, when Iran targeted voters with fake threatening emails supposedly from the Proud Boys. We covered that on this show. Not sure it made much of a difference, but it was more than China did, according to the assessment. The assessment says that China didn't deploy any interference efforts at all. Now, that's interesting, but I would express a slight note of caution there, because back on January 6th, there was a somewhat overshadowed report released by the Intelligence Community Analytic Ombudsman. He said there were differences in the way Russia and China analysts examine their targets. China analysts were apparently more hesitant to assess Chinese actions as undue influence or interference. The Ombudsman thought this was because the analysts didn't want their intelligence used to support Trumpian anti-China policies. He called them biased, essentially. But so we should bear that in mind.
And there was a dissent in that intelligence community report from some of the agencies saying, actually, we think China was involved as well. So there is a question mark there.
There's a bit, Finally, there was Lebanese, Hezbollah, Cuba, Venezuela, you mentioned Cuba, all who apparently took some steps to influence the election, but they were smaller in scale, probably just trying to make some cashola. A lot of this report is actually old news. We have heard some of this before, but it does emphasise how juicy a target American elections are because they're so riven by tensions already. Also, one more thing. We should note the dog that didn't bark, Hunter Biden's laptop. Remember all the speculation about the potential Russian involvement in that story when it broke? No mention whatsoever of it in the report. I just thought I'd flag that.
Yeah, and there were a number of things that were done, including attempts at hacking voter rolls and things which were done, they believe, not to get into the voter rolls, but just to be seen to be trying to hack to raise everybody's hackles and concerns. And this always cuts both ways, doesn't it? Because if you want to bury a story, say like Hunter Biden's laptop, for instance, you say, well, this is Russian misinformation, and the media says, well, we can't get drawn into it. So in a way, it is the new fake news. But now some more good news on the COVID front, with close to 2.5 million Americans getting vaccination shots every day on average. 40 million Americans are now fully vaccinated. Joe Biden says that America will hit the 100 million vaccinations administered mark this weekend, a full 42 days earlier than his admittedly very achievable target set on day one.
Very clap for that target.
Yeah, still good.
But look, the vaccine distribution really is actually doing well. Just look at America's total vaccine doses per 100 people compared to the likes of, say, Spain, Netherlands, Germany, France and Italy. That is a fair effort there, John.
Yeah, less good news though, Chaz, is a very worrying number of people who in America say they don't want to get vaccinated. And as with most things in the state, there is a big partisan split. 42% of Republicans say they probably or definitely won't get the shot, compared to 17% of Democrats.
Even worse, NPR found 30% of adults overall wouldn't take the vaccine if made available to them, but 47% of Trump 2020 supporters would not accept the vaccine. 47%.
Yeah, lots of contributing factors, I suppose, but one of the problems here is a lack of leadership. When President Trump got the jab himself last December, he refused to do it in front of the cameras, unlike Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Mike Pence. Every single living former president other than Trump, they all did it on camera. And there are plenty of Republican members of Congress who are also resisting getting vaccinated, including ophthalmologist and Senator Rand Paul, who has refused to wear a mask. He got COVID last year and now says he got it naturally and he now has natural immunity, and he says that works. So no problem. The Centres for Disease Control begs to differ with Rand. They say you should get vaccinated regardless because experts just don't know how long you're protected if you've had it.
Rand Paul there taking a stand for I'm not quite sure what. Interestingly though, Republican pollster Frank Luntz put together a focus group about whether Trump needed to sell the vaccine harder. And he found that Trump voters didn't actually warm to the idea of Trump telling them to get the shot. They said that their spouse or doctor would be more influential to their decision. And to be fair to Trump, he did tell people to get the shot in his CPAC speech.
He did.
And then he put out this slightly odd statement saying, if I wasn't president, you wouldn't be getting that beautiful shot for 5 years. I hope everyone remembers. That's Trumpian for I approve of this vaccine. And he did also say this earlier in the week.
Would you recommend to our audience that they get the vaccine then?
I would recommend it, and I would recommend it to a lot of people that don't want to get it, and a lot of those people voted for me, frankly. But, you know, again, we have our freedoms, and we have to live by that, and I agree with that also. But it's a great vaccine, it's a safe vaccine, and it's something that works.
So this problem might be even beyond Trump's partisan powers to solve.
Yeah, or his ability to be on both sides of an argument.
There is that. To the border now. They are hard times over there, John. Not only are they being overwhelmed by migrants, but also overwhelmed by Republican politicians looking to dunk on Joe Biden. And the angle du jour this week was that 4 people arrested on the border were on the FBI's terror watch list. That is, since the 1st of October, that period. 3 of them were from Yemen and 1 was Serbian. And that is worth noting, sure, although I think Kevin McCarthy might have oversold it somewhat.
It's not just people from Mexico or Honduras or El Salvador. They're now finding people from Yemen, Iran, Turkey. People on the terrorist watch list they are catching. And they're rushing it all at once.
They're rushing the border all at once?
4 people in 6 months rushing the border.
Anyway, leaving that aside, there is a genuine issue on the border, and it's worth explaining properly what exactly the deal is.
Yes, here's the deal.
Now, for the last few weeks, we've heard a lot about illegal immigration, or asylum seekers, depending on what your politics are. This graph here has been central to the discussion. It shows that from April last year through to January this year, encounters on the southern border rose from 17 to 78,000 people per month. And then this month, they cracked 100,000. Look, obviously, this is not all Joe Biden's doing here, although the punditry might suggest otherwise.
The open border policies.
Open border radicals.
The Biden open borders amnesty agenda.
That's an open border strategy.
But here's what you're not hearing. Out of the 100,000 migrants taken at the border last month, 72,000 of them were instantly deported under Title 42. That's essentially a COVID protection rule. That's 72% rejected instantly. Whereas under Trump, it was about 90% rejected using the same rules. So look, these two numbers are a little different, but it's not quite...
The Biden open borders amnesty agenda.
So what's the real difference under Biden? Well, Trump promised he'd process asylum seekers if they waited in Mexico. They're the Remain in Mexico people, but he stopped doing so, whereas Biden has processed 1,500 of them in about a month. Also, Mexico is no longer taking families with young kids, so Biden is taking them as well. And Biden's taking all unaccompanied children. That's the tricky one there, we'll come back to that. But the biggest difference might simply be Biden's new tone.
The idea that a more humane policy would be in place may have driven people to make that decision, but perhaps more importantly, it definitely drove smugglers to spread disinformation about what was now possible.
Well, whatever the reason, something has definitely happened, because migrants are saying things like, Biden promised us that everything was gonna change. People are literally turning up to the border in Biden shirts, even though almost all of those people are going to get rejected. And literally 25% of the migrants encountered in February were people who had been rejected under Trump, but decided to have another crack under Biden. Now, the administration's trying to combat this open borders reputation with a no-nonsense, not at all confusing message like this.
Así que yo creo que es muy importante subrayar el caso que la frontera no está cerrada y el viaje es muy peligroso y la gente realmente no debían llegar a los Estados Unidos en una manera irregular ahora.
Well, that was a screw-up, wasn't it? But regardless, Biden's got some problems. Firstly, where are you going to put the kids? Unlike that first graph I showed you, there's been a huge jump in unaccompanied minors turning up under Biden. Obviously, they know that he's going to let them in. Their numbers almost doubled in February, and they're still on the rise. They went from 47 kids arriving per day in early January to 203 arriving per day in late January to 321 arriving per day in late February to 565 arriving per day last week. And that has led to the HHS shelters where these kids are being processed for their permanent home to run out of room. They have tried to respond by removing COVID space restrictions and filling them right to the top, but so far it's not making a huge difference. So, when you've got a bottleneck here, the numbers of children in these temporary dodgy border protection facilities obviously start to build up. Remember, people didn't like those border protection facilities very much under Trump, or under Obama for that matter, yet as of Sunday, there were more than 4,200 children in those dodgy temporary facilities, when under Trump, there'd never been more than 2,600 children in those facilities. Now, admittedly, children aren't in cages anymore because the cages have been closed for renovations. Where they are being held, though, is not much better. Take the Donner complex. That's currently holding more than 1,800 people, even though it's designed for 250 people. A lawyer who talked to the boys there said it was so overcrowded the kids had to take turns sleeping on the floor. One of the boys said he could only see the sun when he showered, and that's a shame because some kids only got to shower once in 7 days. And note, We got no photos at all of that facility because the Biden administration won't let anyone take them. When asked about these conditions, Jen Psaki didn't even try to deny it.
Children being hungry, sleeping on the floor, not being allowed outside for days at a time. Why is that acceptable to go on even for one more day? Why is that something that's not being outlawed right now? How is the administration not stopping that today?
Well, Yamisha, it's not acceptable. But I think the challenge here is that there are not that many options.
And to be fair, that is true. They are short of options. Border Protection is legally obligated to transfer kids out of those facilities after 72 hours. But there's nowhere else for them to go. So about 3,000 of the 4,200 kids there have been longer there than 72 hours. In fact, on average, they're there for 117 hours. More than 100 of them have been there for longer than 10 days. So these so-called temporary shelters are becoming less temporary. And let's not forget also that kids arriving with grandparents, siblings or other relatives are being separated from them until they've been vetted, and that can take weeks or even months. So there are separated families in those facilities as well. That's the kids. There's been concerns about adults as well. Namely that more than 420 of the detainees currently have COVID. But many get released into the community anyway because ICE doesn't have the authority to keep them detained once they've been processed. That's true. But look, given America has literally 7 million active COVID cases, a few hundred more, probably not a big deal. What is more of a concern though is that while the system's massively under strain, there are heaps of illegal immigrants not getting caught. On just one day last month, one day, they saw 1,000 people getting away on their surveillance cameras. Small border towns are reporting a dozen high-speed chases every week in each town. And nationwide drug seizures increased 50% from January to February, including an increase of 48% in heroin seizures. All this when the last time there was this kind of migrant surge, the numbers doubled again between February and May. So is this what the next 3 months looks like? We'll see.
Yes, here's the deal.
So, who, if anyone, is to blame for the current situation and what, if anything, can be done? For a Conservative perspective, we're joined by Laura Rees. She worked in senior immigration policy roles at the Department of Homeland Security, now based at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Laura Rees, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks for having me on, John.
Laura, to what extent would you say what we're seeing on the southern border of the United States now is as a direct result of something that the Biden administration has or has not done in its early weeks?
I'd say it's directly due to not only what the Biden administration has done and not done since coming into office, but also the signals that he sent when he was campaigning. For example, during one of the presidential debates, he said that we owe amnesty to people who came here illegally as children. And we're seeing this every day. Thousands cross the border illegally, including the highest number of unaccompanied alien children that we've ever seen.
But Laura, just this week, Biden said, "Do not come here," during an interview with George Stephanopoulos. That's pretty unambiguous, isn't it?
Well, unfortunately, it's too little, too late. He, on day one in office, stopped the Remain in Mexico program, which was very effective at stopping the caravans. He tore up the agreements that the Trump administration had made with the governments of Mexico and the Central American countries that were also very effective in dealing with asylum. He stopped building the border wall. He tried to stop deportations for the first 100 days. He has restricted what Immigration and Customs Enforcement can do, about 90% of their job, and the list goes on. So to now, after doing all of that, to say, sorry, don't come or don't come now, it's too late. The smugglers and the traffickers have already cashed their checks and they are becoming very wealthy, smuggling and trafficking thousands and thousands of migrants from not just Mexico and Central America, but from all over the world. One local mayor is saying the migrants coming through his county is from 49 countries.
And how large a wave of illegal immigrants do you expect to be arriving, given that the pandemic seems to be winding down in the States and the economy winding up again?
Well, I mean, the Customs and Border Protection has already reported in February over 100,000 encounters, and the number just seems to be going up. And so I anticipate the number to go quite high. And meanwhile, the U.S. is struggling with, businesses still shut down and schools still shut down, or, hybrid virtual learning at best. And so our economy is not in good shape, and Americans want to get back to work. And the priority by this president and any president should be Americans and helping them get back to work, and school kids get back to school. But this administration seems to prioritize everybody else and put Americans last, and seems to be singly focused on illegal immigration rather than lawful immigration, and making it easier to come here unlawfully.
Now, Laura, those migration numbers didn't start under Biden. There's been a steady climb since April, even with all those Trump-era restrictions you're speaking about. So why do you think the numbers started climbing then?
So they bottomed out due to early COVID. I mean, if you look at whether it's immigration or any other type of statistics, the numbers for 2020 are just unusual across the board. And so they bottomed out early COVID when everyone first shut down and stayed home. Gradually, you would see the numbers go up, but then the increase accelerates during the late presidential campaign, when Joe Biden was promising things like amnesty, and the smugglers were taking note of it and signing people up to go to the border. And as soon as Joe Biden was announced the winner, you saw migrants cheering and demanding that Biden keep his promise and let them into the country.
Laura, we've been talking like Biden's been very generous to migrants, but 72% of the people who turned up last month were immediately rejected. Don't you think that would make some impact on potential migrants?
So still in place is the Title 42 health authorization to expel migrants due to the COVID pandemic. And so that is still a critical tool while we are still under this pandemic. Other than that, however, I mean, the Biden administration is administering that inconsistently, particularly when it comes to children. But the message is out, and the perception is that people can go north and that they will be let in. And that is why we are seeing so many children, because this administration is not expelling children unless they are from Mexico. But from other countries, they are not being expelled.
Laura, you talked about the perception that Joe Biden's gone soft. He's thrown open the border, even though that is not the reality, but it is a perception that's being fueled by Republican members of Congress going to the border saying there's a crisis, Fox News on a nightly basis saying there's a crisis, we're being invaded. So they're fueling that false perception, aren't they?
So that's the Democrats and the left are very good, and I admit the media as well, at portraying things as a crisis. The Democrats' quote is "never let a good crisis go to waste," and so we jump from crisis to crisis, whether they are in fact a crisis or not. The numbers show that daily encounters for Customs and Border Protection right now is about 6,000. Under President Obama, then Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson said 1,000 encounters a day was a bad day. And so we are now facing 6 times that.
Laura Rees, thanks for joining us on Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
And we also spoke to David Beer from the Cato Institute, who says this isn't really about Biden's policies, it's about regional and seasonal factors.
There's very little to do with the Biden administration. This is really a resurgence of immigration that we saw at very high levels in 2019 under the Trump administration. There was a brief hiatus in 2020. People were not traveling legally or illegally as a result of the pandemic. Huge pent-up demand for immigration as a result of that year-long hiatus in travel, and we're seeing it sort of explode now in 2021.
That disagreement between Laura and David is highly debatable. To remind people, there was a clear post-COVID easing up in migrant numbers, as Laura suggested, and there has been a clear jump since Biden took over, also as Laura suggested. But the jump that Laura said occurred after Biden's election win seems a little harder to make out, to me at least. You can decide for yourself.
Yes, and you can find both interviews on our Facebook page and the ABC News website as well. Joe Biden described it as his proudest achievement in 36 years in the United States Senate, the passage of the landmark 1994 Violence Against Women Act. But more than a quarter of a century after being signed into law, the act remains controversial and it is again at the centre of a major political and cultural struggle. October 13, 1994, just weeks after his push for healthcare reform collapsed, President Bill Clinton finally had a major legislative win, a tough bipartisan crime bill.
Never again should Washington put politics and party above law and order.
The $30 billion bill put an extra 100,000 police on the beat, introduced 3 strikes laws for mandatory sentences and built more prisons. Some would credit it with bringing down America's soaring crime rate. Others would blame it for mass incarceration, disproportionately targeting black men.
Let us roll up our sleeves to roll back this awful tide of violence and reduce crime in our country. We have the tools now. Let us get about the business of using them.
After the signing, Clinton embraced one of the principal authors of the crime bill, Delaware Senator Joe Biden, head of the Judiciary Committee, who helped to build that cross-party support with rhetoric like this.
It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street.
Biden sponsored Title IV of the crime bill, the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, which he'd been pursuing for years, holding hearings with survivors.
My husband stabbed me 13 times and broke my neck while the police were on the scene. I nearly died and I am permanently paralyzed.
In 1994, the issue of domestic violence was in the news following the murder of Nicole Brown, the ex-wife of footballer and actor O.J. Simpson, who had abused, threatened and stalked her for a decade.
What is he doing? Is he threatening you?
He's going nuts.
Okay, has he threatened you in any way, or is he just harassing you?
You're going to hear him in a minute. He's about to come in again.
Okay, just stay on the line.
I don't want to stay on the line. He's going to beat the shit out.
Wait a minute. Wait, just stay on the line so we can know what's going on till the police get there, okay? Okay, Nicole?
Uh-huh.
2 years later, Simpson was charged with murdering Nicole Brown and her friend Ron Goldman, but was acquitted by a jury.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information.
Simpson was later found liable for their deaths in a 1997 civil lawsuit. Meanwhile, the Violence Against Women Act focused on domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence and stalking, including mandatory arrest laws. It allocated $1.6 billion in grants to aid the investigation and prosecution of crimes. It established a domestic violence hotline and a federal office of violence against women. Beyond the specifics, it sent the message to police and prosecutors that intimate partner violence was not something to be kept behind closed doors. It is a crime. VAWA needs to be reauthorised, though, every 5 years, and it was with bipartisan majorities in 2000 under Bill Clinton and 2005 under George W. Bush. But when it came up for renewal, first in 2010, that consensus broke down. Conservative Republicans opposed the extension of the Act to include same-sex couples and undocumented immigrants, and As Vice President at the time, Joe Biden was once again campaigning for its passage.
If you told me that I'd be standing here in 2012, when the law has been in existence over 17 years, when tens of thousands of women and girls have been helped, when police departments now investigate these crimes and put offenders behind bars in almost every instance, when the annual rates of domestic violence have dropped by more than 60%, when states have moved independently and passed over 700 laws among the 50 states.
The Obama administration won a protracted legislative battle to expand VAWA, including guarantees that survivors could not be denied housing rights. In 2018, the Trump administration, though, allowed it to lapse, with only stopgap funding passing Congress since then. As a candidate for president, Joe Biden said reauthorising VAWA would be a top priority, as would addressing campus assaults, but he also managed to turn it into a gaffe.
No man has a right to raise a hand to a woman in anger other than in self-defense, and that's rarely ever occurs. And so we have to just change the culture, period, and keep punching at it and punching at it and punching at it. It will be a big... No, I really mean it. It's a gigantic issue.
And within weeks, Biden himself was accused of sexual assault by a former staffer from back at the time he was drafting the Violence Against Women Act.
Would you please go on the record with the American people? Did you sexually assault Tara Reade?
No, it is not true. I'm saying unequivocally, it never happened.
Within days, though, the coronavirus pandemic had become an all-consuming news story. The primary was all but over, and because Biden's presidential rival Donald Trump had been accused himself of rape, sexual assault and sexual harassment by 26 women, the allegations did not become a major issue during the 2020 campaign. Intimate partner violence has fallen significantly since the 1990s, more than 50% for both women and men, yet it remains a major problem, and advocates are now calling for improved support for minorities, including LGBTIQ Americans. 1 in 3 American women and 1 in 7 men have experienced severe physical violence from an intimate partner. 45% of women murdered in America each year are killed by a current or former partner. For men, that figure is 5%. And yesterday, the reauthorised Violence Against Women Act did pass the House of Representatives by a comfortable 244 to 172 majority, 29 Republicans voting with Democrats.
The bill is passed.
Straightforward enough, but the 50-50 Senate poses a much steeper test. Some Republicans are against closing the so-called boyfriend loophole, which would extend a ban on spouses convicted over domestic violence from owning guns to dating partners and stalkers. The National Rifle Association is opposing VAWA on the grounds that they say it impinges on Second Amendment rights to bear arms. And other Republicans are against a provision allowing transgender women access to domestic violence shelters. The House vote came a day after 7 women and 1 man were killed by a gunman at 3 massage parlours in the Atlanta area. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo is continuing to resist calls for him to resign following allegations of inappropriate comments, touching and kissing from 6 women. This week, New York's Democratic Senators Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand added their voices to the chorus demanding Cuomo step down. President Joe Biden was asked about it on Monday and he was still a bit non-committal.
Mr. President, do you think Governor Andrew Cuomo should resign? I think the investigation is underway and we should see what it brings us.
But by Wednesday, the president was going a little bit further.
If the investigation confirms the claims of the women, should he resign?
Yes, I think he'd probably end up being prosecuted too.
That was significant, given that Biden and Cuomo enjoy a, quote, easy rapport that has matured into a deeper friendship, according to the New York Times, cemented when Biden served as a character witness for Cuomo in his 2018 campaign against a left-wing primary challenge from actor Cynthia Nixon, who accused Cuomo at the time of corruption and dishonesty. New York State Assembly, including some top Democrats, have started an impeachment investigation centred on those harassment claims, as the investigation headed by Attorney General Tish James continues to look at the women's women's allegations, as well as Cuomo's handling of the COVID pandemic and that dodgy nursing home death data. The governor, though, is digging in.
I'm not going to resign. I was not elected by the politicians. I was elected by the people.
Governor Cuomo pushing back amid growing calls for him to go, and he again denied wrongdoing.
I have not had a sexual relationship that was inappropriate, period.
A spokesman later expanded that denial, saying Cuomo has not had any romantic relations with any staffer.
Well, that was a little more convincing than some of Cuomo's other calls during that same press conference.
People know the difference between playing politics, bowing to cancel culture, and the truth. Part of this is that I am not part of the political club. And you know what? I'm proud of it.
I'm not sure what's cheekier, Cuomo describing being potentially held accountable for committing a crime as cancel culture, or Cuomo saying he's not part of the political club. This is a three-term governor who's the son of a three-term governor. I mean, he said this literally 1 minute later.
My entire life, I have been under public scrutiny since I was 23 years old and ran my father's campaign.
As for whether Cuomo resigns, it may not be his call to make. It only takes 76 votes in the Legislative Assembly of New York to lodge an article of impeachment, and Cuomo is looking like he might have 81 votes against him already. The thing is, in New York, when your impeachment trial is on, you step down whether you like it or not. And maybe more people don't like it than we think. NPR this week found 57% of New Yorkers said they were satisfied with the way Cuomo has addressed the allegations. And only 35% say he should leave office, compared to 50% who say he should not leave office. Well, that's up to them, but I would remind New Yorkers of what Cuomo did back when he was first accused of sexual harassment. Within hours of the accusation, several news outlets reported they'd been given state government documents related to the accuser Lindsay Boylan's job performance, including suggestions that 3 black employees accused her of treating them like children. Then, in the next few days, the governor's office called at least 6 former employees to get info on the accuser, encouraging at least one to give reporters any discrediting information. And those calls were made by current administration officials and former aides who are still close to Cuomo. And it was apparently coordinated by Cuomo's top aide. Subtle. And then people tied to the governor apparently put the fruits of their labour into a letter that suggested the accuser was supported by lawyers and financial backers of Donald Trump. So were those the actions of an innocent man? You decide.
Yes, time for a fireside chat, Chaz, and there are growing calls amongst Democrats in Washington, D.C. to abolish the Senate filibuster. That's the rule that requires a supermajority of 60 votes to pass legislation unless it's directly related to the budget, which means that Democrats need at least 10 Republicans right now to support any bill. The filibuster stands in the way now of major votes on things like voting rights reforms, the For the People Voting Rights Act, H.R. 1, potentially as well if they want to finally increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Democrat Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says changing the filibuster is certainly on the table.
We Democrats, all of us, believe we need big, bold change. As I've said before, we hope our Republican colleagues will work with us to produce that change. We will try to get them to work with us. But if not, we will put our heads together and figure out how to go, and everything is on the table.
For weeks, the White House has been trying to deflect questions about the filibuster by talking up the prospects of bipartisan compromise.
He's met with members on both sides of the aisle in the Oval, and he wants to continue to work on a bipartisan basis. And we believe there are opportunities to do exactly that.
And there may be some opportunities for bipartisanship. Issues like infrastructure spending plays well on both sides, at least in theory, although they do tend to disagree on the details. Republicans want to build highways and airports. Democrats want to build windmills and solar farms. But look, only an optimist would say that they're going to get 60 votes right now for the Voting Rights Act at a time when, at a state level, lots of Republican lawmakers are trying trying to limit access for minority voters in particular. The Republican Minority Senate leader Mitch McConnell, who has been a master at using the filibuster to block legislation for the last 10 years or so, while scrapping it for Supreme Court nominations, by the way, he's warned Democrats against making any more changes to the filibuster. He says that removing it now would be a disaster, and he's vowed to use all of the other powers of Senate obstruction to stop Democrats from passing bills without the backing of Republicans.
This chaos would not open up an express lane to liberal change. It would not open up an express lane for the Biden presidency to speed into the history books. The Senate would be more like a 100-car pileup. Nothing moving.
But President Biden now seems to be working towards another option, filibuster reform rather than filibuster removal. He wants to make senators actually filibuster, not just threaten to do it, just as they did in the old days.
You had to stand up and command the floor. Once you stopped talking, you lost that, and someone could move in and say, I moved the question of. So you got to work for the filibuster.
Because the reality, of course, is the majority decided some time ago that having a talking filibuster, we actually have to do the whole Mr. Smith goes to Washington thing. That wastes everybody's time. So let's just say a threat of a filibuster, that'll do, let's move on. But if this change does come in, we could see a lot more of this.
But I've discovered that there are some limits to filibustering, and I'm going to have to go take care of one of those in a few minutes here.
Rand Paul being endearing for once. The strange thing about this, though, is that Mitch McConnell rebutted himself in his own speech. You know, like you said, he said, if you remove the filibuster, Republicans are going to grind the Senate down to a standstill. But directly before that grab you just played for Mitch McConnell, he said this.
Perhaps the majority would come after the other rules next. Perhaps Rule 22 would just be the first domino of many, until the Senate ceased to be distinct from the House in any respect.
Okay, so what's wrong with the Senate being like the House, where the majority wins? He didn't even attempt to explain why that would be a problem. Just so that moved on. The fact is, the Senate has an issue here. It really does. These are the cloture votes over the last 40 years. What I mean by that is the number of times they had to overcome a filibuster. There's well over 100 a year now. And you know what that tells me? That tells me what you said before about the policy disputes. That's not the reason why. They don't disagree over policy 100 times a year. That graph is showing you that there's obstruction for no reason whatsoever. That's what that's telling you. And I'll give you a great example. Katherine Tai, a name nobody knows, but the very day Mitch McConnell made that speech that we just played, Katherine Tai was confirmed as Biden's US trade representative. But she was only confirmed after they invoked cloture to end the debate. In other words, they had to beat a filibuster to confirm her, and that's fair enough. Maybe she was controversial for some reason. After all, she only won confirmation by 98-0. Literally no one opposed her confirmation. Not one person. But they filibustered the confirmation anyway. Why? Just to waste time. And that's taking the piss. If Mitch McConnell really cares about preserving Senate traditions and minority influence, he shouldn't blatantly abuse his powers for nuisance value. Am I raving here? Like, isn't it?
A little bit.
There's complete bad faith.
Yeah. And so many of the arguments in all of this idea that, the filibuster, it's a grand tradition, it's about making the Senate a cooling saucer away from the fevers of the House of Representatives. And it's true, the House and the Senate are different. The House is elected every 2 years, and it is therefore highly responsive to political ebbs and flows. The Senate, elected every 6 years, only a third of it every 2 years. So as a result, it's meant to be a lot more of a chamber of review, of consideration, but also of bipartisan compromise. And in the old days, up until really the 1990s, senators were representatives of their state first rather than representatives of their party. You had a lot more Republicans and Democrats actually banding together across party lines and getting to 60 votes quite easily on all sorts of issues, getting to 70, 80 votes on all sorts of issues if it was in their collective interest. But now they have become a much more parliamentary-style partisan chamber. And unfortunately, just as there used to be a filibuster in the House, they got rid of that because it was gumming up the works. Now this is gumming up the works in the Senate, and particularly when it comes to voting rights. a lot of sensitivity, particularly amongst African Americans, because the most grotesque misuse of the filibuster up until the last 10 or 15 years, really starting with Obama, was, of course, the filibustering of civil rights laws and voting rights laws during the civil rights era, back when it was Democrats using their minority powers to obstruct those pieces of legislation going forward.
Yeah, either use it responsibly or get rid of it. I just want to say one more thing before we move on. I know we're running out of time, but the question is how you reform it, if you do. Now, Joe Manchin says he's open to reforming the filibuster. He's the 50th vote they need, but he won't lower the 60-vote threshold to lower votes or carve out subjects as filibuster-free, like, say, voting rights reform, and he won't require 41 senators to sustain the filibuster, he says. Now, that technical bit of lingo I just said at the end, that 41 votes, that, in my view, is the whole ball game, because at the moment, you need exactly 60 votes to break the filibuster. That means if you do talking filibusters like they're talking about, you still need 60 votes to stop it, right? Which means there's no reason why one person can't just speak for 6 hours, then tag team with the next one person.
Right.
And you still need to get 60 votes to end it, right? Yep. Whereas if you changed it to being you need 41 votes to keep it going, then you need 41 people in the House, in the Senate at all times. Yep. As soon as there's less than 41 people, you go, well, let's move on, right? So at the moment, if they do talking filibusters, they'll be able to keep them going at 4 a.m. They'll be able to keep them going 24 hours easy. If you have to keep 40 people in the Senate from the Republican Party to keep that going at 4 a.m., you won't get 41 people there then. It's going to be
a big lifestyle change for a lot of Republican senators if they want to filibuster.
Yeah, so what I'm saying, just to keep this very, very quick, is if they don't make that change, that 41 vote change, the talking filibusters won't make any difference at all. It'll actually help the minority, it'll gum up the works, and it won't solve any problem.
Well, the one difference it will make, which I think is what both Biden and Manchin favour as a minimalist approach, is make them do the filibuster. Yeah. Make them talk, make them own it, because that means on issues such as last week's stimulus bill, relief bill, which has 70+% approval in the community, it's not as though this bill just suddenly just disappears into the never, and people go, oh, why didn't that never pass? Oh, there's a filibuster. Right. You actually have to have Republicans stand there, own it, talk it, and say, this is why we're opposing this legislation. So they're thinking, OK, it's going to put more political pressure on the minority.
And give them free publicity and the opportunity to raise money.
Yeah.
Anyway, we should move on.
They'll both enjoy it, I'm sure.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
Talk about malarkey. The Washington Post was forced to issue a pretty embarrassing correction this week to a January story about President Trump's attempts to pressure Georgia state election officials into overturning the result of last November's election and declare Trump the winner. The Post quoted Trump as telling Georgia's investigator of elections, Frances Watson, to, quote, find the fraud, and that she would be a, quote, national hero. Well, not so much a quote. That was corrected this week after an actual tape of the actual conversation emerged. Trump said she would find, quote, dishonesty, and that she had the, quote, most important job in the country right now. The source for those misquotes was the Deputy Secretary of State, Jordan Fuchs, who was briefed on the contents of the call by Watson but did not hear the actual conversation or tape. Fuchs confirmed her second-hand account to numerous other media outlets after the story appeared, confirming it as far as all those other media outlets were concerned as well. President Trump then issued a statement after the correction declaring,
the original story was a hoax. Right from the very beginning.
And then, of course, he repeated his baseless claim that the election was the subject of significant voter fraud.
We are seeking to find and reveal the large-scale election fraud which took place in Georgia.
And then he took a swipe at the establishment media, pretty much just for old time's sake.
You will notice that establishment media errors, omissions, mistakes, and outright lies always slant one way, against me and against Republicans.
A couple of things to say about this, Chaz. First of all, misquotes. They should never have appeared in quote marks. And that's 101 journalism, unless the reporter had heard the recording and was able to verify it, or was directly quoting the source of the quotes, who they then contextualise as paraphrasing a conversation they were a part of. But this is all second-hand stuff. So this is a problem. And then, of course, these other media organisations chasing the breaking story seemed like a big deal. They then went and spoke to the same person and said, yeah, that's what they said. So, like, just bad journalism all in all. But There is ample evidence that Donald Trump, as for him saying this is a hoax, he did exert inappropriate pressure, according to the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, and Raffensperger did tape the conversation he had with Trump. That was made public back in December because Raffensperger was so appalled by Trump's meddling in this way. And the hoax, if we're going to talk about the hoax, of course, is Donald Trump saying that there was enough voter fraud to overcome a 12,000 vote deficit in Georgia. But it certainly muddies the whole issue, doesn't it?
It does. I just want to focus just briefly on the independent confirmations from the other newspapers, because that to me highlights the problem with anonymous reports in newspapers. Because if you saw all those, there was like 5 or 6 of them, all said independently confirmed, some of them by multiple sources, you would think as a reader that there were heaps of multiple sources confirming this story. This story must be good. But actually, it was all the same person. And the truth is, as a reader, you can't know if it's all the same person who might have an agenda or might just be wrong, or if it's not, if they're all anonymous confirmations. In fact, the reporters themselves can't know if the other stories have the same source or not, because they're all anonymous. And to me, that's one of the main reasons why over the last few years, there's been some real hit and miss journalism, because I think there's so much anonymity, it's very difficult to pin down exactly what's going on.
Yeah, of course, we wouldn't have had Watergate without anonymity, but you've also got to not pretend it's a quote when it's not a quote. But that's it for another trip to Planet America. We'll see you back here at the same time next week for a look at NASA's plan to send the first woman to the moon. And you can always catch up on iView, YouTube and Facebook as well.
And we have a new pet podcast as well, of course, right there. But before we go, Joe Biden's secret weapon in high-level talks with the Chinese delegation in Alaska, it's the threat that Secretary of State Antony Blinken will sing at them. Presenting America's chief diplomat, Abe Blinken.
Bye-bye.
You said you liked me fine, but not in that way. Or was it such a crime to want you to stay? And then I came on to you, but you said let's just be friends, yeah. You're paying me lip service tonight. You're paying me lip service tonight. You're paying me lip service tonight. Lip service tonight.